a businessman saw a child begging at the traffic light. When he rolled down his car window, he couldn't believe what the child was capable of doing. The sun was setting over the city, casting a golden glow on the cracked pavement and the endless stream of cars rushing home. Jacob, a 9-year-old boy with scruffy hair and dirt-streaked cheeks, stood at the traffic light, gripping a squeegee in one hand and a spray bottle filled with soapy water in the other. The corners of his oversized hoodie were frayed, and his sneakers had more holes than sole, but his eyes still sparkled with determination. He scanned the rows of cars inching forward in the congested traffic. "Pick the fancy ones," he muttered to himself. "They always give more." Jacob darted toward a shiny red convertible, its chrome bumper reflecting the city lights. With a practiced smile, he held up the squeegee. The driver, a man in sunglasses, frowned and waved him off, rolling up the window. Jacob didn't take it personally. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. His stomach growled, a sharp reminder that he hadn't eaten since the slice of leftover pizza he'd found in a trash can that morning. Shrugging off the rejection, he turned to a minivan stuck in the same lane. "Hi, ma'am," he called out, his voice chipper. "Can I clean your windshield?" "Only $1. The woman behind the wheel shook her head, avoiding eye contact. Her kids, sitting in the back seat, pressed their faces against the glass, giggling. Jacob gave them a quick wink and spun the squeegee in his hand like a baton, drawing more laughter. But no dollar. Jacob sighed and moved to the next car. As he approached a sleek black sedan, the traffic light turned red, giving him a few precious seconds to make his pitch. The car's windows were tinted, but he could see the faint outline of the driver inside. He tapped lightly on the glass and offered his brightest smile. Inside the car, Mr. Bennett, a sharply dressed businessman in his mid-40s, glanced up from his phone. His day had been exhausting, back-to-back meetings, endless emails, and a deal that was slipping through his fingers. When he saw Jacob's face through the window, his first instinct was to ignore him. He'd seen kids like this before, dirty, desperate, and persistent. Most of the time, they only caused trouble. Jacob, undeterred, pressed his palms together in a mock plea. "Please, sir, just 1 minute. I'll make it shine like new." The boy's persistence annoyed Mr. Bennett, but something about the kid's expression made him pause. He rolled down the window halfway, letting in a gust of cool evening air. "All right, go ahead," Mr. Bennett said curtly, fishing a dollar bill out of his wallet. "Just make it quick." Jacob's grin widened. "Thank you, sir. You won't regret it." With the efficiency of someone far older than his years, Jacob sprayed the windshield and began scrubbing, humming a tune as he worked. Mr. Bennett watched from inside the car, mildly amused. The boy worked with surprising precision, carefully wiping away every streak until the glass gleamed under the fading sunlight. When Jacob finished, he stepped back and gave the windshield an exaggerated bow, as if he were a performer on a stage. "Told you it'd shine," he said, holding out his hand for the dollar. Mr. Bennett chuckled despite himself and handed over the bill. But just as Jacob was about to thank him, a loud honk from behind startled them both. The light had turned green, and the cars were beginning to move. "Get out of the way, kid," a voice yelled from a pickup truck. Jacob darted back to the sidewalk, narrowly avoiding the traffic. The black sedan sped off, leaving him alone again. He stuffed the dollar into his pocket, already calculating how many cans of soup it might buy. But as the evening deepened and the traffic thinned, Jacob's energy began to wane. He walked to a nearby convenience store, hoping to stretch his earnings. Inside, the clerk gave him a skeptical look but didn't stop him from grabbing a can of beans and a small loaf of bread. $2.75, the clerk said flatly. Jacob fished out his crumpled bills and coins, falling short by 25 cents. "Can I come back tomorrow and pay the rest?" he asked, his voice small. The clerk shook his head. "No credit here, kid." Defeated, Jacob returned the bread to the shelf and settled for the can of beans. Outside, he found a quiet corner near an alley to eat, using his fingers to scoop out the cold beans. He shared a few bites with a stray dog that wandered near him, its ribs visible under its matted fur. As night fell, Jacob found an abandoned doorway to sleep in. Pulling his hoodie tight around him, he stared at the stars peeking through the gaps in the city skyline. His life was hard, but he refused to give up. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to try again. Unbeknownst to Jacob, the black sedan he had cleaned earlier was parked just a few blocks away. Inside, Mr. Bennet sat in silence, the boy's face lingering in his mind. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt something stir, an urge to see that kid again. Jacob returned to the traffic light early the next day, tired but determined. The chilly air bit at his fingers as he clutched his squeegee and spray bottle. He scanned the cars crawling to a stop, looking for anyone who might be willing to spare $1. Spotting a shiny black sedan in the line, Jacob approached with his practiced smile. He knocked lightly on the driver's window and raised the squeegee. "Sir, can I clean your windshield?" "Just $1." Inside the car, Mr. Bennet glanced up from his phone. His day had already begun with stress, deadlines piling up, deals falling apart. Seeing Jacob through the window only added to his irritation. "Not today, kid," he muttered, returning his attention to his screen. But Jacob was persistent. He held up the spray bottle and gestured toward the windshield, as if to say, "You won't regret it." Mr. Bennet sighed, rolled down the window just enough, and handed Jacob $1. "Go ahead. Make it quick," he said curtly. Jacob grinned. "Thank you, sir." He got to work with practiced efficiency, spraying and scrubbing until the glass gleamed. As he finished, he stepped back and gave the windshield a quick polish with the edge of his sleeve, then shot Mr. Bennet an exaggerated thumbs up. The corner of Mr. Bennet's mouth twitched in amusement. "Good job," he said, rolling up the window as the light turned green. Jacob watched the car drive off, tucking the $1 into his pocket. It wasn't much, but it meant food for the day. Hours later, the street quieted as lunchtime approached. Jacob leaned against the traffic light pole, catching his breath. His moment of rest was interrupted by Rick and his gang, a group of older street kids who often claimed the best corners for themselves. "Hey, Jacob," Rick called out, his voice mocking. Jacob stiffened. "What do you want, Rick?" Rick smirked, flanked by two of his lackeys. "You've been working our spot all morning. Time to pay up." Jacob's grip on his squeegee tightened. "I don't have anything to give you." Rick stepped closer, his smirk fading. "Don't lie to me, runt." Before Jacob could respond, the low hum of an approaching car made them all pause. The black sedan from earlier slowed to a stop at the corner. The tinted window rolled down, and Mr. Bennet's stern face appeared. "Get in, kid," he said firmly, motioning to the passenger door. Jacob hesitated, glancing between Rick and the car. Rick's glare turned venomous, but he stepped back as Jacob darted toward the sedan. Once inside, Jacob slumped into the seat, his heart pounding. The scent of leather filled the air, a stark contrast to the grime of the streets. "Those boys giving you trouble?" Mr. Bennet asked, glancing at Jacob as he merged back into traffic. Jacob shrugged. "They're just bullies. I can handle it." Mr. Bennet raised an eyebrow but didn't push. After a moment, he asked, "Have you eaten?" Jacob shook his head. Without a word, Mr. Bennet pulled into the parking lot of a small diner. Jacob hesitated at the door, eyeing the clean floors and polished booths. "I don't have any money," he mumbled. "I didn't ask if you did," Mr. Bennet replied, holding the door open. Inside, they sat at a corner booth. The waitress approached, her friendly smile faltering when she noticed Jacob's worn clothes. Mr. Bennet gestured for her to focus on him. "Order whatever you want," he told Jacob. Jacob blinked. "Anything?" "Anything." Jacob cautiously ordered pancakes and eggs. When the food arrived, he devoured it in minutes. Mr. Bennet watched in silence, his thoughts clouded. He couldn't quite understand why he'd stopped to help this boy, but something about Jacob's determination struck a chord. "What's your story?" Mr. Bennet asked. Jacob hesitated, lowering his fork. "My mom left a few years ago. Said she'd come back, but she didn't. I've been on my own since then." The answer hit Mr. Bennet harder than he expected. He leaned back, suddenly feeling a pang of guilt for every time he'd ignored a kid like Jacob before. When the meal was over, Mr. Bennet pulled out his wallet and handed Jacob a business card. "If you ever need help, call this number." Jacob took it, running his fingers over the raised letters. "Why are you helping me?" Mr. Bennet hesitated. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it. Sometimes, people just need a chance." Jacob nodded, tucking the card into his pocket. For the first time in years, a spark of hope flickered in his chest. Jacob had begun to settle into his temporary life at Mr. Bennet's home. The guest room, with its soft bed and thick blankets, was a world away from the cold, hard concrete he was used to. He took pride in doing small chores, eager to prove he wasn't just some street kid freeloading. But even as the days passed, he couldn't shake the wary gaze of Mrs. Harding, the housekeeper. Mrs. Harding was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, with neatly styled gray hair and a permanent frown etched into her face. She had worked for Mr. Bennet for over a decade, and in her mind, Jacob didn't belong. One afternoon, while Jacob was sweeping the hallway, he overheard her speaking to Mr. Bennet in the kitchen. "This boy is trouble, Mr. Bennet," she said in a low, firm tone. "You're too kind for your own good. People like him, they take advantage. Mark my words, he'll repay your kindness by stealing from you." Jacob froze, the broom slipping from his hands. He clenched his fists, a familiar wave of anger and shame rising in his chest. He wanted to march in and defend himself, but he didn't. Instead, he returned to his chores, determined to prove her wrong. That evening, Mr. Bennet came home later than usual. Jacob greeted him at the door, proud of the spotless kitchen he had cleaned while Mrs. Harding was out running errands. "Impressive work," Mr. Bennet said, nodding at the gleaming countertops. Jacob grinned. "I told you I'd pull my weight." But just as Mr. Bennet set down his briefcase, Mrs. Harding burst into the room, her face flushed with anger. "It's gone," she exclaimed. "What's gone?" Mr. Bennet asked, frowning. "My brooch," Mrs. Harding snapped. "The sapphire brooch my mother gave me. I left it on my dresser this morning, and now it's gone." Jacob's stomach dropped. He could already feel her accusing eyes on him. "I didn't take it," he said quickly. Mrs. Harding folded her arms. "Oh, really? Who else could it have been? You're the only one wandering around this house all day." "Mrs. Harding, let's not jump to conclusions," Mr. Bennet said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm not jumping to conclusions," she replied. "This boy has been here less than a week, and already things are going missing. I warned you, Mr. Bennet." Jacob felt his throat tighten. "I didn't touch it," he repeated, his voice trembling. "Then where is it?" Mrs. Harding shot back. Mr. Bennet looked between them, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Harding, let's take a moment to search the house before accusing anyone. Jacob, do you mind waiting in your room for now?" Jacob's heart sank. The request felt like a punishment, even if Mr. Bennet hadn't said so outright. He nodded stiffly and retreated upstairs, his chest heavy with a mix of frustration and humiliation. Hours passed, and no one came to speak with him. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the small bag of belongings he'd brought with him. He thought of the streets, the cold, the hunger, the loneliness, and for a moment, he considered leaving. "Why did I think this would be any different?" he thought bitterly. Just after midnight, he made up his mind. Grabbing his bag, Jacob slipped out of the house as quietly as he could. The warm glow of the guest room's lamp felt like a distant memory as he stepped into the cold night air. When Mrs. Harding checked Jacob's room the next morning, she found it empty. "He's gone," she said triumphantly. Mr. Bennet frowned, guilt gnawing at him. we don't know what happened yet. He's just a kid. But Mrs. Harding wasn't listening. Exactly. A street kid. You should count yourself lucky he didn't take more. Despite her words, Mr. Bennet couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a mistake. He searched Jacob's room, hoping to find some clue as to where the boy had gone. Instead, he found something else, a folded piece of paper tucked under the pillow. Unfolding it, Mr. Bennet saw his own business card, the embossed letters worn from handling. Scrawled on the back in shaky handwriting were the words, "I didn't do it. Thanks for helping me." Mr. Bennet sat down heavily, the note clutched in his hands. Somewhere deep inside, he knew Jacob was telling the truth. Meanwhile, Jacob had returned to the streets. He stood at the same traffic light where he'd first met Mr. Bennet, the cold wind biting at his face. The warmth of the past few days felt like a distant dream, and once again, he was back to surviving. "I should have known better," he thought, gripping his squeegee. "People like me don't get second chances." Little did he know, Mr. Bennet wasn't ready to give up on him just yet. The streets were colder than Jacob remembered. The brief taste of comfort at Mr. Bennet's home had made the harsh reality of sleeping on the ground even harder to bear. He curled up in an alleyway that night, using his thin hoodie as a blanket. The familiar pang of hunger gnawed at his stomach, but he ignored it. There wasn't much else he could do. By morning, Jacob was back at the traffic light, ready to work. His fingers felt stiff as he gripped his squeegee, and his spray bottle was nearly empty. He glanced at the passing cars, but his usual energy was gone. Every rejection felt heavier, every honk sharper. As Jacob cleaned a windshield for a middle-aged woman who paid him 50 cents, he saw Rick and his crew approaching from the corner of his eye. His heart sank. "Back at it already, huh?" Rick sneered as he strolled up with two of his goons. "Didn't you learn your lesson last time, Jacob?" Jacob straightened, gripping his squeegee tightly. "I don't want any trouble, Rick." Rick laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You don't want trouble? Then why are you working my corner? You know the rules." "It's not your corner," Jacob shot back, his voice shaky but defiant. Rick's grin turned dangerous. "Oh, it's not? Then I guess we'll just have to teach you another lesson." Before Jacob could react, one of the older boys lunged forward and shoved him to the ground. His squeegee clattered onto the pavement, out of reach. Rick leaned over him, smirking as he grabbed the few coins Jacob had managed to earn that morning. "Thanks for the donation, kid," Rick said, jingling the coins in his hand. Jacob's face burned with anger and shame, but he didn't fight back. He knew better than to take on three older boys by himself. As the group walked away, laughing, Jacob sat on the curb, staring at his empty hands. Why does it always end like this? That evening, Jacob found himself at the back entrance of a grocery store, rummaging through a dumpster for scraps. He managed to find half a stale sandwich and a bruised apple, which he scarfed down quickly. As he sat behind the store, trying to gather his thoughts, a small voice caught his attention. "Hey! Leave me alone!" Jacob turned to see a younger boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, being cornered by two older teens. The younger boy clutched a worn backpack to his chest, his wide eyes darting between his attackers. "Give us the bag," one of the teens growled. "No! It's mine," the boy cried. Jacob's instincts kicked in. He stood and approached the group, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling in his chest. "Hey! Leave him alone!" The teens turned to him, their faces twisting in annoyance. "What's it to you, runt?" one of them sneered. Jacob didn't back down. "Pick on someone your own size." The older boys hesitated, sizing him up. Jacob wasn't big, but he carried himself with a confidence that gave them pause. Finally, they muttered curses under their breath and walked away, leaving the younger boy trembling but unharmed. "Are you okay?" Jacob asked, crouching down to the boy's level. The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face. "They wanted my bag. It's all I have." Jacob patted his shoulder. You're safe now. Just be careful, okay? As the boy ran off into the night, Jacob felt a small spark of pride. Despite everything, he'd stood up for someone else. It reminded him of what Mr. Bennet had said, sometimes, people just need a little help. But as the hours dragged on, Jacob's own hopelessness began to creep back in. The streets felt lonelier than ever, and the bitterness of Mrs. Harding's accusations replayed in his mind. He wandered aimlessly until he found himself back at the same traffic light where he'd first met Mr. Bennet. The familiar hum of cars and the glow of headlights felt surreal, like a memory playing out in real time. Jacob sat down on the curb, staring at the business card he still carried in his pocket. He'd thought about calling the number more times than he could count, but the fear of rejection stopped him every time. He probably thinks I'm a thief, Jacob thought bitterly. Why would he want to help me now? Meanwhile, Mr. Bennet was pacing his living room, the note Jacob had left still in his hand. The weight of guilt sat heavy on his chest. Deep down, he knew Jacob wasn't the type to steal, but he'd let Mrs. Harding's accusations sway him. Where could he be? He muttered to himself. For the first time in years, Mr. Bennet left his work unfinished, grabbing his coat and keys. He drove through the city, stopping at shelters and street corners, asking anyone he could find if they'd seen a small boy with scruffy hair in a squeegee. As the hours passed, the city felt impossibly large. But Mr. Bennet refused to give up. The storm that had been brewing all day finally broke, rain pouring down in sheets as Jacob sat shivering by the traffic light. He tucked his knees to his chest, the card still clutched in his hand, and closed his eyes. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a car pulling up made him glance up. Through the rain, the sleek black sedan came into focus, and Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Mr. Bennet stepped out, his coat already soaked, and ran toward him. "Jacob," he called, his voice firm but filled with relief. Jacob froze, unsure if he was dreaming. "Get in the car," Mr. Bennet said, kneeling beside him. "We're going home." The warmth of the car's interior enveloped Jacob as he sat silently in the passenger seat. Rain streaked down the windows, but the storm outside felt distant compared to the whirlwind in his mind. Mr. Bennet hadn't said much since he'd found him at the traffic light, but his presence alone spoke volumes. For Jacob, it was both comforting and unsettling. "I owe you an apology," Mr. Bennet said finally, his hands gripping the steering wheel. His tone was firm but carried an undercurrent of regret. Jacob looked at him, confused. "For what?" "For not believing in you," Mr. Bennet replied, glancing at him briefly before focusing back on the road. "Mrs. Harding accused you of something you didn't do, and I let her words cloud my judgment. That wasn't fair to you." Jacob blinked, his fingers tightening around the damp business card still in his pocket. "You believe me?" "Of course, I do," Mr. Bennet said without hesitation. "I found the brooch in the lining of Mrs. Harding's coat. It must have fallen in there when she was rushing to put it on. She feels terrible about what happened." The knot in Jacob's chest loosened slightly, but he still felt uneasy. "So, why come back for me?" Mr. Bennet glanced at him again, his expression softer now. "Because everyone makes mistakes, Jacob. I made a big one, and I don't want it to cost you the chance at a better life." Jacob looked out the window, the rain blurring the city lights. He wasn't used to people admitting they were wrong, let alone apologizing. A part of him wanted to trust Mr. Bennet, but the years of disappointment made it hard to believe this time would be different. When they arrived back at Mr. Bennet's house, the storm was still raging. Mrs. Harding was waiting in the foyer, her usual stern demeanor replaced with visible discomfort. "Jacob," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I owe you an apology too. I misjudged you, and I'm sorry for what I said. It won't happen again." Jacob stared at her, unsure how to respond. Her words sounded genuine, but the sting of her accusation still lingered. He nodded slightly, avoiding her gaze as he shuffled past her into the living room. Mr. Bennet placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's your choice whether you stay, Jacob. But I hope you'll give us another chance." Jacob hesitated. He looked around the house, its warmth and safety feeling almost foreign after the cold streets. Finally, he nodded. "I'll stay," he said quietly. Mr. Bennet smiled, relief washing over his face. "Good. Now, let's get you cleaned up and fed." Over the next few days, life slowly returned to a new normal. Jacob helped around the house, did his chores, and began to adjust to the routine. But something had shifted. The trust between him and Mr. Bennet grew stronger, though it was still fragile. Mrs. Harding, true to her word, made an effort to be kinder to Jacob. She left small snacks for him on the counter and asked about his day, though her awkwardness made it clear she was still learning how to connect. Jacob appreciated the effort but kept his guard up. One evening, as they sat at the dining table, Mr. Bennet brought up a new idea. "Jacob," he began, setting down his fork. "Have you ever thought about going back to school?" Jacob's eyes widened. "School? I haven't been to school in years." "I know," Mr. Bennet said gently. "But you're smart, resourceful. You could do really well if you had the right opportunities." Jacob's instinct was to resist. School felt like a world that didn't belong to him anymore. But the way Mr. Bennet spoke, calm, encouraging, made him wonder if maybe, just maybe, it could work. "I don't know," Jacob said hesitantly. "What if I'm too far behind? What if the kids there don't like me?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Mr. Bennet replied. "But you deserve a chance, Jacob. And I'll be here to help you every step of the way." Jacob nodded slowly, the flicker of hope reigniting in his chest. While Jacob adjusted to this new chapter, Mr. Bennet took steps to ensure his future. He made calls to local schools, explaining Jacob's situation and advocating for his enrollment. The process wasn't easy. Some schools were hesitant, and others outright refused. But Mr. Bennet's determination didn't waver. Finally, he found a small charter school willing to take Jacob in. It was a modest place, with small class sizes and a focus on helping students who had fallen behind. "This is it," Mr. Bennet said one afternoon as he showed Jacob the school. "A fresh start." Jacob stared at the building, a mix of nerves and excitement churning in his stomach. He still wasn't sure if he belonged here, but the thought of having a real chance at a better life made him take a deep breath and nod. That night, as Jacob lay in bed, he thought about the events of the past weeks, the traffic light, the accusation, the storm, and Mr. Bennet's unwavering support. He still had doubts, but for the first time in years, he felt like maybe he wasn't entirely alone. "I can do this," he whispered to himself, clutching the blankets tightly. "I have to." The first day of school was harder than Jacob had anticipated. Standing outside the modest brick building, he tugged at the straps of his second-hand backpack, his palms sweaty. Kids streamed past him, chatting in groups or hurrying to their classrooms. Jacob felt invisible, and for once, he wasn't sure if that was a good thing. Inside, the brightly decorated hallways and the low hum of chatter made his stomach churn. He was led to a small classroom where a teacher with a kind smile introduced him to the other students. "This is Jacob," she said warmly. "He'll be joining us starting today." A few kids glanced up, curious but uninterested. Jacob muttered a shy hello and slid into an empty desk near the back. The day passed slowly, and although no one was outright mean to him, he could feel the distance between himself and the other kids. That evening, as Jacob sat quietly at the dinner table, Mr. Bennet noticed his slumped posture. "Tough first day?" he asked. Jacob nodded, poking at his mashed potatoes. "No one talked to me. I don't think they like me." Mr. Bennet set his fork down, leaning forward. "Jacob, these things take time. You've been through so much, and it's okay to feel out of place at first. But don't give up. You're stronger than you think." Jacob looked up, the encouragement sinking in. "Do you think I'll ever fit in?" "I don't just think so," Mr. Bennet said with a small smile. "I know you will." As the weeks went by, Jacob began to adjust to his new routine. While academics were challenging, he worked hard, often staying late after school for tutoring. Slowly but surely, he caught up. The teacher, noticing his dedication, began to call on him more often in class, boosting his confidence. Socially, Jacob was still hesitant, but a breakthrough came when he helped a classmate named Nate during a group project. Nate, who struggled with reading, was grateful for Jacob's patience, and the two struck up a tentative friendship. At home, Jacob started to feel more at ease. He and Mrs. Harding still had their awkward moments, but one afternoon, everything changed. Mrs. Harding was carrying a heavy box of groceries into the house when Jacob noticed her struggling. Without a word, he rushed to help, taking the box from her arms. "You don't have to do that," she said, her tone softer than usual. "I want to," Jacob replied simply. For the first time, Mrs. Harding smiled. It wasn't forced or polite, it was genuine. From that moment on, their relationship shifted. She began leaving little treats for him, like freshly baked cookies, and even taught him how to cook one of Mr. Bennet's favorite meals. "You're not so bad, Jacob," she said one evening as they worked side by side in the kitchen. Jacob grinned. "You're not so bad yourself." But Jacob's journey wasn't without setbacks. One afternoon, as he was walking home from school, he saw Rick leaning against a lamppost near the old traffic light. His stomach tightened. "Well, look who cleaned up nice," Rick said, smirking. "Living the high life now, huh?" Jacob kept walking, but Rick followed him, his tone turning taunting. "You think you're better than us now? Just 'cause some rich guy took pity on you?" Jacob stopped, turning to face him. "I'm not better than anyone, Rick. But I'm trying to do something different with my life." Rick scoffed. "You think that's gonna last? Guys like you and me, we don't get second chances. Don't fool yourself." For a moment, doubt flickered in Jacob's mind. But then he thought of Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Harding, and even his teacher and classmates who were rooting for him. He straightened his shoulders. "Maybe we don't," Jacob said. "But I'm going to prove you wrong." Rick's smirk faltered, and he waved dismissively before walking away. But Jacob knew this wasn't just about proving Rick wrong, it was about proving to himself that he could succeed. When Jacob got home that evening, he told Mr. Bennet about the encounter. "I didn't let him get to me," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. Mr. Bennet smiled. "That's because you're stronger than you were before, Jacob. You're starting to believe in yourself, and that's what matters." Jacob nodded, the weight of Rick's words fading. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just surviving, he was growing. The trust between Jacob and the people in his life had been tested, but it was stronger now than ever. With each small victory, he was taking another step toward the future he had once thought impossible. Years later, the sound of children laughing filled the air as Jacob stood in front of a small community center. The building, painted in bright colors, had once been abandoned, but now it was bustling with life. Jacob, now in his mid-20s, adjusted his tie nervously and looked at the crowd gathered before him. The event marked the opening of a new program Jacob had started, one designed to help at-risk children get the support they needed, whether it was food, shelter, or access to education. His dream of giving back to others was finally coming true. As he stepped up to the microphone, Jacob couldn't help but think about how far he had come. Memories of the cold streets, the fear of rejection, and the moments of hopelessness flashed through his mind. But just as vivid were the memories of kindness, the day Mr. Bennet gave him his first meal, the warm home that had become his sanctuary, and the people who believed in him when he couldn't yet believe in himself. Jacob's voice was steady as he began to speak. "When I was a kid, I thought life didn't have much to offer me. Every day was about survival, finding my next meal, a safe place to sleep, or avoiding trouble. But someone gave me a chance, and that changed everything. I'm here today because of that chance, and I want to make sure other kids like me get the same opportunity." The audience, made up of donors, community members, and children from the neighborhood, applauded warmly. After the ceremony, Jacob stood near the entrance of the center, greeting guests. Mr. Bennet, now retired, approached with Mrs. Harding by his side. Her once stiff demeanor had softened over the years, and she carried herself with a quiet pride as if Jacob's achievements were her own. "You were great up there," Mr. Bennet said, clapping Jacob on the back. Jacob smiled. "I had a good teacher." Mrs. Harding handed Jacob a small plate of cookies, a callback to the early days of their tentative friendship. "You've done something incredible here, Jacob," she said, her voice filled with genuine affection. "I couldn't have done it without you both," Jacob replied. Later, as the event wound down, Jacob noticed a young boy sitting alone on the steps of the center. The boy's clothes were worn, and he clutched a small backpack tightly to his chest. Jacob approached slowly, crouching down to meet the boy's gaze. "Hey there," Jacob said gently. "What's your name?" "Marcus," the boy mumbled, looking down. "Nice to meet you, Marcus," Jacob said, offering a warm smile. "Are you okay?" Marcus hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't have anywhere to go." Jacob's heart ached at the familiar words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card with the center's contact information on it. "Well, Marcus, you're in the right place," Jacob said. "This is a safe spot for kids who need help. You don't have to do this alone." The boy looked up at him, a spark of hope flickering in his tired eyes. As Marcus was welcomed inside by one of the volunteers, Jacob stood on the steps, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He thought back to the moment Mr. Bennet had handed him a business card at a traffic light so many years ago. One act of kindness had changed his life. Now, Jacob was determined to pay it forward, ensuring that no child ever felt as hopeless or alone as he once had. With the sound of laughter echoing behind him, Jacob smiled to himself. The future was bright, not just for him, but for every child who walked through those doors.